Hi everyone, a big thank you for joining us this evening. It is great to see some of you here. We are just getting the live stream up on the YouTube and then we will get started. Okay, let's get going. First and foremost, thank you to Yanis Varoufakis for joining us this evening. For those of you who don't know, I think most of you probably will, but for those of you who don't, I'll read out a brief bio and then we'll get started. So Yanis Varoufakis is a Greek economist and former politician. He served as the Greek Minister of Finance from January to July in 2015, where he was responsible for negotiations with Greece's creditors during the debt crisis. Having failed to reach an agreement with the European Commission, the European Central Bank and the IMF, the 2015 bailout referendum took place, which rejected the EU's bailout terms and led to Yanis to resign. Yanis is also the Secretary General of a left-wing Greek political party and is the author of multiple books covering topics from game theory to the European debt crisis. So today I'm going to start off by asking a few questions, and I'll bring in some questions that you guys sent in beforehand, and then we'll have plenty of time for audience questions at the end. Feel free to write them in the chat as we're going, or you can ask them live on the camera if you're on the Zoom call when we get to that point. I think there's only one place we can start, really. There is a major war happening in Ukraine at the moment. So Yanis, what is your analysis of where we are now at with the war in Ukraine?
By the way, thank you so much for the invitation, and even for indicating that I might be a former politician. I wish I were a former politician. I'm afraid I'm an active politician, but one hopes that I will be a former politician soon. Having said that, it's a tragic war. It's industrial scale misanthropy. The unleashing of the invasion actually shook me. I have to confess before we move on that I wasn't expecting it. I was hoping that it would be what President Biden inadvertently referred to as a minor incursion. It wasn't a minor incursion. It was industrial scale warfare. To your question, where do I think we are? Well, I think we're at the beginning of a very long-term quagmire, a cross between Afghanistan and Syria and maybe Cyprus, the frozen conflict that began in 1974 on the island of Cyprus. It's clear that there is no peace process to speak of. I believe very strongly, and we will discuss this, no doubt, that there should be a peace process. Because the alternative is this stalemate. I fear that Putin will soon dig in the areas that he has occupied. He has established for himself a corridor between Crimea and the Russian border, including Mariupol, a major port that was effectively destroyed before it was taken over. And once he digs in, he may very well declare a ceasefire. A unilateral ceasefire, and if he does that, then I think the West is going to be in a conundrum. What do you do when he has entrenched himself? And he says, "Okay, let's stop the war and start talking." I think that is where the nakedness of Western policy is going to emerge, because behind this show of unity of the NATO countries, which has been impressive, there's no doubt about that, there is lack of strategic thinking. There's been absolutely no serious discussion of what the Western strategy should be. This very lazy talk over the last few weeks of a final Ukrainian victory and regime change in Russia is just that, wishful thinking. And I don't believe that wishful thinking is a solid foundation for strategy.
So if we were to go back a few months and the West was to form more of a coherent strategy, how do you think, in practical terms, the West would go about forming that? Are there particular institutions that you think should have taken a more leading role, or politicians, I'm assuming President Biden, you probably think should have taken more of a leading role in building that Western alliance and strategy. How do you see it playing out differently and better from a Western strategic point of view?
Look, Washington, D.C. did play a role, succeeded, there's no doubt about that, in leading the West. The European Union has disappeared. There's no such thing in practical terms as a union. NATO has overshadowed the European Union, and behind NATO, it's Washington. So NATO and the United States dominate the Western side. They call the shots. President Biden is the only authority speaking for the West. Germany has imploded in terms of its political leadership. The era of Angela Merkel, when Angela Merkel was leading Europe, and to a large extent, especially under the regime of President Trump in Washington, Angela Merkel was more of a world leader than the United States president was. That's gone. The German political class, along with the German business model, economic model, is in tatters, absolutely in tatters. President Macron tried to fill in the gap, failed miserably. Remember the long table in which he was sat by Vladimir Putin. There's no such thing as the European Union. The European Union could play a role if there is a peace process, which is to be led by Biden, whether we like it or not. So to be succinct in answering your pertinent question, I think what I would have liked to have seen is an American president who takes it upon himself to talk directly to Putin. Because let's face it, there's no way there can be any peace process involving Putin and Zelensky. Zelensky represents a country that has been invaded. There's nothing that Zelensky and Putin can agree upon that either Putin or Zelensky will be able to count on. Because without security guarantees by Washington, by President Biden, Zelensky will never be able to believe anything Putin tells him, and vice versa. Putin was not going to have to. He will not feel that there's anything to discuss with Zelensky unless Biden is part of the deal. And if, therefore, there were a process whereby there is multilateral negotiation, a negotiation that is between Ukraine and Russia, but with Biden in the room, with the European Union in the room, not to provide political leadership, because as I said, there is no such thing as the European Union. It's a figment of our imagination, but the EU has a lot of money, and the EU can provide the funds for rebuilding Ukraine that Zelensky is going to need. The Americans will not provide a single penny for that. They only provide weapons, and they charge for them as well to a very large extent. But ideally, I can imagine a roundtable involved, with Zelensky and Putin, Biden, the European Union, and yes, maybe China as well. That kind of setting might, there's no guarantee here, but it might produce a peace treaty that is the only long-term viable alternative to a quagmire.
We'll come back to the European Union in a moment, but you mentioned Merkel there, and Merkel has obviously been heavily criticized for misjudging Putin. Do you think if she was in power that she would have taken a different approach to Scholz? It seems like you're quite critical of his approach to the war. Do you think Merkel would have taken a different direction?
I don't think she would be able to, because the problem that Germany has is that its whole business model, I referred to this before, was such that it would, whatever the chancellor or whoever the chancellor might be did, this business model is simply not fit for purpose in today's environment and today's geostrategic environment. I will be very, brutally honest with you. I think that the business model that Germany built over the last few decades, and it was a model that was built before Merkel, under Schröder, who of course is in the pockets of Putin today, has been for a while. But then it was built upon by Merkel. This business model is based on two very simple principles: cheap energy from Russia, and a vital space, economic vital space, provided by the periphery of the European Union. So the periphery of the European Union, countries like mine, were providing the German industrial machine with the aggregate demand that was necessary to keep their factories going. Then after, in 2010, countries like mine went bust. Germany managed to replace its markets. Instead of selling Volkswagens to the Greeks, it was selling them to the Chinese. And therefore, the German business model has been based on complete dependency for energy on Putin and for exports, net exports, to the periphery of Europe, which was destroyed by the German policies in the European Union, things that I have intimate knowledge of. You alluded to that in your introduction, and to China. So given that President Trump began a new Cold War against China, which President Biden is exacerbating, and given that Putin has invaded Ukraine and therefore set off a domino effect leading to the disruption of the supply of cheap energy to Germany, the German business model is in serious trouble. So I'm not saying that if Merkel were around, it would be very, very different. What I did mention was, the reason why I mentioned it was as a reminder of a different era, before the new Cold War between the United States and China, and before Putin's invasion of Russia, during which somebody like Merkel could be the leader of the free world instead of the Americans or the American president. Today, it is, the American president is back in that role. And that is why I'm putting the onus of peacemaking on President Biden. Not because of President Biden as a person, but because that's the only office that can actually pull it off. And that is also why I'm incensed with President Biden for silly things that he has said. Because when he says that, we have to get rid of this guy, Putin, when he talks about dragging him through an international court that does not exist, and it doesn't exist because the United States vetoes its existence, which, think about it, it's a bit mad to call for a court that you're refusing to institute. What is the message he's sending Putin? That there will be no peace. And therefore, that Putin, this is the message that Biden sent Putin, win this war, or, occupy half of Ukraine and carry on doubling down on your misanthropy and your killings and your aggression. Because the alternative is that we will get you. You'll have the ending of, Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein. Well, do we really want that? Do we really want Putin to be absolutely cornered? I'm just astonished by the number of people who are talking about, regime change in Russia, as if we've learned nothing. Regime change has never worked for the West. Every time the West has tried it, Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, whenever, it was a complete and utter catastrophe. I mean, it was only a few months ago that the Americans were fleeing from Kabul after that experiment with regime change went pear-shaped. So to imagine that they will overthrow Putin, not only will they overthrow Putin, but they will overthrow Putin because they cannot overthrow Putin themselves. They will support a set of dynamic forces that will somehow in a Darwinian fashion select for another strongman who will murder Putin and take his place. And that strongman is also going to be a nice guy who does peace with the Ukraine and makes peace with the West. Now, I think that it is, one has to be bordering on the criminally insane to assume that was going to be that will be the outcome, and to bet the whole house, European house, on that outcome.
Could you not also argue that as a lot of people have, that it's impossible for there to be any serious or meaningful security in Eastern Europe with Putin in power, given the fact that he has sort of destroyed any reason to place any trust in him. And if there is some kind of treaty to end the war, or to try and get some security guarantees in place, there's very little reason to trust anything that Putin signs on to. And to that end, the only way in which there's going to be any meaningful long-term security in Eastern Europe is with some different leadership in Russia. And it could be worse, but on the balance of probabilities, that is something worth going for. Or do you not buy any of that argument at all?
I find it very naive, and it flies in the face of history. I mean, the whole point about peace treaties with which to end wars is that you actually have them, you strike them, you agree them with people you don't like, with enemies, with the bad guys. Because if somebody is nice and opposite to you, you don't need a peace treaty. You just get on. I mean, Greece and Britain do not need a peace treaty because we're friends. So you have to have a peace treaty with somebody you loathe. Can you trust Putin? Well, look, I mean, in a way, Putin was true to his word. The problem of the West was that we never believed him. I hope that what I'm going to say is not going to be distorted, but I will say it nevertheless. Putin has no excuse for invading Ukraine. He had no, I mean, when he says he had no choice, it's absolute rubbish. Of course he had a choice. He attacked, he could have decided not to attack. So I make this as my preface, quite clear, right? Having said that, he has been making very loud noises for many years now about NATO expansion, the expansion of NATO. And he's been saying something which is not completely mad if you think about it, that it is important to have a buffer zone of neutral states between NATO and Russia. Now, ideally, NATO and Russia should not be enemies. We should be friends, right? And then we would have no problem. But given that the United States of America is largely responsible for the fact that after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, there was no attempt to integrate Russia into a peace and security arrangement for the whole of Eurasia. And the Russians wanted it at the time. It was the United States that never wanted it and always made, I remember when I was teaching at the University of Texas, I remember a former advisor of President George W. Bush, who actually worked a lot in NATO, and he was the point man of W. Bush in NATO, who happened to be the dean of the school in which I was teaching. I remember having lunch with him, and I asked him about his view regarding NATO. What were you doing? What were you up to? I said, in the 1990s in Europe, you Americans. And he said, oh, well, our concern was very, very simple. How to remain in Europe as Americans, how to keep Germany down and Russia out. So it was a clear attempt by the United States to marginalize Russia, to keep Russia on the out, to maintain NATO under American leadership in opposition to a Russia that was already destroyed as a result of economic crisis and humiliation of the collapse of the Soviet Union and so on. And there wasn't, it is clear that there was at least a gentleman's agreement between Gorbachev and Reagan, and then Bush Sr. and Yeltsin, that the former Eastern European or former communist countries outside of Russia would not be enter NATO. And then one after the other started entering NATO. Now, do we really want American nuclear missiles side by side with Russian nuclear missiles, let's say along the Ukrainian-Russian border? I don't think it's healthy. Remember, Turkey, which is a NATO country, had a common border with the Soviet Union. And after the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we nearly lost the plot and the world exploded, nearly. We came so close during the Cuban Missile crisis. Part of the agreement between Khrushchev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, and JFK, leading the United States, a silent part of the agreement was that, okay, the Russians would take away their nuclear missiles from the island of Cuba, but the Americans would also withdraw their nuclear missiles from Turkey. The idea being that, if you have a common border and you have two nuclear blocks, it's not a good idea to have your nukes side by side. So was there any attempt by the West, by NATO, by the United States to take seriously the Russian concern, which is a concern not only of Putin, but also of Russian Democrats and people who don't like Putin in Russia, the people who will have to work with? Was it smart not to take into consideration this, this notion of a buffer zone between NATO and Russia? I think that was a reasonable thing. The fact that this reasonable idea was being pushed by an unreasonable criminal like Putin doesn't make it less reasonable. And the fact that we turn a blind eye to this gives him not an excuse, but reasons to and actually leverage with Russian public opinion. So I truly believe that if Putin is given a way out, a way to maneuver himself out of the very difficult position that he has created for himself. Thankfully, the Ukrainian armed forces and resistance gave him a huge bloody nose. He didn't take Kiev. He was defeated in the northeast of the country. He had to go for plan B. He had to downgrade his military objectives, concentrate on Donbass and maybe a corridor between Donbass and Crimea. It's a major humiliation that Putin has suffered. But if you cannot expect him to commit suicide, you've got, if we care about peace, you have to give him a way out and ask yourself the question: if you do give him what he's asking for, what he was asking for, not now what he's asking for now. Now he's asking for to keep everything. But what is the alternative to the quagmire? To give him a way to retreat and to call it a victory. Retreat to where his troops were stationed before the 24th of February. That would be a good outcome. And if you were to agree to such a thing with President Biden, in Reykjavik, in Iceland, there were some famous summits between Soviet leaders and American leaders in Reykjavik, in Iceland. I imagine them, Biden and Putin and Zelensky and so on meeting in Reykjavik and having this agreement. I think he would stick to it. And of course, there are no guarantees, right? But this is a much safer bet than betting on a perpetual war that one day will overthrow Putin. That is an irresponsible choice. Especially, come to think of it, the Americans and NATO, we are behaving, I say we, as a bloc, we're behaving like the Americans were behaving before Pearl Harbor. Before Pearl Harbor, the Brits were being killed, the Russians were being killed, the Greeks were being killed in the war against the Nazis. The Americans were not being killed. They were sending money and armaments, primarily to the United Kingdom under Churchill, but they didn't have any skin in the game. That was a very hypocritical position to take prior to Pearl Harbor. Well, this is the position we're taking. We are prepared to continue fighting Putin until the last Ukrainian is killed. It's sickening. It's morally dubious, especially when we keep saying we are not going to have to put any skin in the game.
Okay, so one of the alternative arguments that people like Gary Kasparov have been making really vocally over the past few months is that giving Putin a way out won't work because the motivations are not to do with things being provoked by NATO or EU expansion or democratization, but this is about re-establishing the Soviet Union, more or less, and he wants to kill the Ukrainian people. It's not about territory, but this is about going after lost land, and to that end, any kind of negotiation or appeasement to Putin will end up coming back to bite us, because ultimately his aim is not to take parts of Ukraine, but to take the Ukrainian population. I'm assuming that's something you disagree with. Could you explain a bit about your thinking as to why that argument is wrong?
I think it's very simple why it's wrong. Because even if it's right, I think that what I'm saying still holds. Let's assume for a moment that he never cared about NATO's expansion. He never cared about anything except taking half of Ukraine. Right? Let's assume that Garry Kasparov is right, who, by the way, was a fantastic chess player, never a very sound political thinker, but nevertheless, let's take it on face value. All right? He tried it. He tried to take Kiev. He was never going to take the whole of Ukraine, but he wanted the eastern Ukraine, half of Ukraine, let's say. Let's say he wanted the whole of Ukraine, right? Well, he didn't get it. He got a bloody nose. Now he's cornered. Like the Ukrainians are cornered, he's cornered. We have a quagmire. That is the definition of a quagmire. It's not going well for either side. Both sides are in deep trouble. And so you see the whole of humanity, with hunger spreading in Africa and so on. Now, given that he's running out of tanks, he's running out of soldiers, the sanctions are biting him, right? His plan A was destroyed. His plan B was destroyed. Now he's struggling to make something of plan C. He's not an idiot. He's cruel and he's a criminal, but he's not stupid. He can see these things are not going well. And he can see that at some point, if this continues for another 5-10 years, yes, maybe some strongman is going to murder him in his sleep. So it may very well be true that what Garry is saying is so, that he had other objectives and he didn't give a damn about NATO expansion and all that. But it is also true that even if that were the case, now he's looking for a way out. Okay. There is also a possibility that we will give him the way out and he will not take it. Fine. What is there to lose? What is there to lose from having a summit like the one I described, my fantasy summit in Reykjavik, which fails? If it fails, we are back to where we are now. We've got exactly zero to lose and a world to gain if it succeeds. I think we should give peace a chance. So that's my comprehensive answer to Garry Kasparov.
That's great. Thank you. Let's take a bit of a different couple of themes before we go to audience questions. So I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you coined the term technofeudalism. Could you explain a little bit about what this is, what it means, and I guess why it's a problem?
Look, I've been trying to make sense of capitalism all my life. And I thought I was doing reasonably well until 2008 hit, the great financial catastrophe, when every single bank in the West went bankrupt. And we had that avalanche, which you're too young to remember, but I'm old enough to have lived through and to have studied. Now, strange things have been happening since 2008, things that my understanding of capitalism could never fathom. They were completely at odds. The way, the observations and my understanding of capitalism. Now, it could be that my understanding of capitalism was wrong. We political economists tend to be, very jealous of our understanding of capitalism. So I try to be humble and assume that I was wrong in my understanding of capitalism, to reassess my understanding of capitalism. But increasingly, I was drawn to the conclusion that I don't think I was wrong. I think that what we now are experiencing, the mode of production, to use an old-fashioned expression, the system, the economic system that we live in, is no longer capitalist. Now, that is an outrageous statement, of course, because wherever you look around you, you see capital triumphing. Capital is going from strength to strength, as opposed to labor, as opposed to in democratic politics. Power is increasingly in the hands of capital, which is highly concentrated in terms of its ownership. So how can I possibly be imagining that capitalism is gone? Well, remember, capital is a means of production, a produced means of production. It was always here. It existed before capitalism. Under feudalism, the way to have power, the road to power, went through land. It was land ownership that made one a member of the landed gentry, a lord, a baron, whatever, and also rich. It's not that we don't have land now. Of course we have land, and people who own land are very rich. But why do we say that now we have capitalism, whereas once upon a time we had feudalism? Well, the reason is that capitalism from the end of the 18th century in Britain and a little bit in Amsterdam to this day, or to 2008, if I'm correct in my hypothesis, is a system that is unique, or was unique, was different to all other sorts of socioeconomic systems for two reasons. One is that it was the first economic system in the history of humanity where the fuel that drove everything was profit. Before capitalism, that wasn't the case. Profit played a very minor role. History was driven by rent, by economic rent, the receipts, the benefits one got from land ownership, which is not profit, right? It's rent. Remember David Ricardo. Those of you who have suffered a little bit of economics should. It was driven by conquest. It was driven by concepts of glory and concepts of that are closer to mercantilism, accumulating the gold of the Incas and the Mayas, if you were the Spanish Empire. None of that was entrepreneurial profit. So capitalism is distinguished by two things. One is that it is driven by profit. And the second pillar of capitalism is that all the interesting stuff happens in markets. All the interesting economic activities happened through markets. Again, before capitalism, that wasn't the case. So, if you were to go to Yorkshire or Scotland or to, somewhere in France during feudalism, what you would see is peasants working the land. They never received a wage. There was no such thing as a wage. Okay, they worked the land. The harvest would come in. Then the sheriff would arrive, sent by the baron or the lord on behalf of the baron or the lord to collect the landowner's share of the crop. And what was left to the peasants. There was no wage. There was no profit. It was quite brutish, primitive accumulation in a sense. But with capitalism, the land becomes commodified. So you have a real estate market. It's bought and it's sold and it's rented and it's leased. And labor becomes commodified. Workers get paid upfront, a wage. Upfront, I mean before the harvest comes in, by the day, by the hour, by the week, by the month, right? So you have a labor market. Labor goes through the labor market. Capital goes through the market for capital. Land goes through the market for land. So, to cut a long story short, capitalism is a system based on profit and markets. Unique in the history of the world, 18th century. Never existed before. Huh? So we have to understand that. So that was the era that gave rise to people like Adam Smith to try to explain the new situation. Now, capitalism has undergone many serious, huge transformations. So with the second industrial revolution and the production line and Henry Ford and the huge, mega firms like Edison and Westinghouse that were vertically integrated, producing everything from the electricity in the power station all the way to the light bulb that was being lit up by the electricity. This is a very different model of capitalism to that which Adam Smith would recognize of the baker, the brewer, and the butcher, right? But still, it was capitalism because it was driven by profit and everything happened through markets. Then that whole system collapsed in 1929 with the Great Depression. You had a planned economy, the war economy, the Bretton Woods system. Remember, I grew up, because I'm an oldie, I grew up in a system which will sound extremely alien to you. Think about it, between the age of 0 and the age of 15, I grew up here in Greece, the exchange rate between the drachma and the pound, between the drachma and the dollar was fixed. Never changed between my birth and the age of 15. There was no point in reporting it in the newspaper because it was given, right? Interest rates were 4%, plus or minus 0.3% forever. Capital controls. You could not export money. You could not take money out of Britain. When I first moved to Britain to study in Britain in 1978, as a Greek citizen, I had to get permission from the Bank of Greece to bring money to Britain, so that I could survive as a student. And if you were, and my friends, my English friends, would need permission to get a certain amount of money. It was capped how much they could get if they wanted to go on holiday, in France. So a very different capitalism, right, to the one that you can imagine today. And yet it was capitalism because profit and markets were at the center of it. Then we had financialization. What you may have, erroneously identify in your mind with neoliberalism. I don't believe in neoliberal. I don't believe that neoliberalism is ever a good explanation of what was going on. But the economy that grew under Margaret Thatcher in Britain and Ronald Reagan in the United States, very different beast to the one I understood in the 1970s, right? And then the 2000s come with hyper financialization and subprime mortgages and CDOs, the CDO squares and CDSs, still profitability and markets. Today, after the crash of 2008, I don't believe that the system we live in depends on profits and markets. Today, the role of profits has been taken over after years and years of the crisis that started in 2008 and never left us. It's still with us. It's just morphing into something else. The main fuel of the system we live in is central bank money. It's the money that the Bank of England keeps minting. This is why everybody now is watching. They're not watching the profit reports of the companies in the in the Dow Jones index. They're watching, what the Federal Reserve does, what the Bank of England does, what the ECB does in terms of money printing. The money that is printed by central banks, what is called the balance sheet of the central banks, is now the driving force of capitalism. That's very different from private profits. And secondly, increasingly, markets are irrelevant. The moment you visit Amazon.com, you've left capitalism. You left the market because Amazon.com belongs to one man. If you go into Amazon.com to sell something, you have to deal with that man or his algorithm. Right? If you try to buy something, if you enter and you search for something, Amazon.com, there's an algorithm that decides what you will see. And if you and I go and search for the same thing in Amazon.com, we will not get the same results. The algorithm will tell you something, will probably say something different to me. It will be tailor-made. So this is the equivalent of stepping outside the house in the physical world and finding yourself in the midst of a realm that belongs to one man, not to a community, not to a state, not to a commons, to one man who decides what you can buy, what you can't buy, what you see. That is scary. What you see depends on that algorithm. Now, you know what this is like? It's a fiefdom, like, an estate back in the feudal era, even before Downton Abbey, chronologically speaking, before capitalism came. Only it's a digital fiefdom. So if I'm right in my hypothesis that what drives the society we live in is state, central bank, minted digital money, like the king's money, and digital fiefdoms. What do you call that? I call it technofeudalism.
Okay, really interesting. Thank you, Yanis. We'll turn to some audience questions now, and we'll kick off with one which I think connects to what you're saying there, which is, would you break up big tech? And if so, how would you go about doing it?
Okay, you just reminded me. A few years ago, I had the honor, privilege, and extreme joy of giving a talk at Google in California. And I raised a few eyebrows because I said, firstly, I congratulated them, like we all should, because they've created a search engine and other algorithms without which we couldn't imagine our lives now. And I said, with your search, the brilliance of your search engine, you invented the human right. Because imagine that Google were to say, you know what, Tom, you will never use Google search engine again. It's like denying you a human right now. And I said, well, the problem is that when you have invented the human right, then you can't own it anymore. It's a human right. It should be publicly available. So setting that preface aside, look, I don't believe you can break down or break up big tech. How do you do it? I mean, it's, this whole discussion, I'm sorry, this is Mowgli deciding that he wants to participate. The beauties of Zoom, right? All this discussion of taking WhatsApp away from Facebook. I mean, firstly, WhatsApp doesn't make a profit. It cannot survive on its own. It is there in order to give more power to Zuckerberg within Facebook. So how would you break this up? And how can you break up Facebook? Facebook is a global thing. It's a global digital fiefdom. Its whole power comes from the fact that your friends are in there, independent of whether they live in the United Kingdom or in France or in Greece or Scotland or wherever, right? So I really can't wrap my mind around the idea of breaking up big tech. What I can wrap my mind around is the idea of changing the ownership structure, of changing corporate law. Who owns what? And in my last book, which was an attempt at political science fiction called Another Now, let me plug it, in Another Now, where I tried to just imagine, as part of science fiction, how could the world work without a hugely concentrated power. I toy with the idea of using the democratic principles of one person, one vote in the corporate world. So I say, imagine that, okay, you change only one thing. Corporate law says that you cannot buy or sell shares. Shares are no longer tradable. And they're given to somebody who's been hired by a company. So you go through the grueling interview process to, let's say, join Facebook. You're hired. Well, just like in a university, when you went to King's, you were handed an ID card or a library card, right? You can't buy it, you can't sell it, you can't lease it, you can't wager it, you can use it. And when you leave King's, you have to hand it over, or it's no longer applies. It's not valid anymore. So imagine if shares were like that. So everybody in Facebook or ExxonMobil or a small company near you operated along those lines. Everything changes. Everything changes monumentally. The size of corporations is going to shrink because in this kind of share ownership model, if we all worked for a large company, we would like to shrink the size of our company because it's more manageable, in terms of optimal management or self-management, democratic management side. So for instance, if you take a company like General Electric in the United States, that makes lots of different things, from engines for aircraft to washing machines, where maybe the people making washing machines say, let's form our own company. Let's ourselves choose to spin off a washing machine General Electric company. And then you don't need to have a state that in an authoritarian way comes in and says, no, I'm going to break you up. No, you leave it. It happens organically. And I would like to live in a world where the principle of one person, one vote is extended to corporations. Because if you come to think of it, it's absurd. You've got shareholders meetings, shareholder meetings that resemble Sotheby's or Christie's auctions. If you go to a Christie's auction in London, okay, take the train and go from Cambridge to London and just for fun, go and watch a Christie's auction. It's an auction where you don't see any of the bidders. Most of them are on the phone. You have no idea who's bidding. Some of those people on the phone are bidding on behalf of somebody else who's onto another phone to something else. So similarly with a share owners meeting, you've got all these people that, they come in with proxy votes representing 60% of the company. You don't know who these people are. They're proxy vote holders. And if you have 60% of the votes, there's no point having a meeting. You might as well decide everything. But imagine that was one person, one vote. I think it would be a very exciting world.
Okay. I think Teja has a question, and I think she's on the Zoom call. So if you're able to, perfect. There we go. Over to you, Teja.
Hi, Teja.
Hi, Yanis. So we've recently had a talk by Bill Browder as well. So Bill Browder was talking about how, the sanctions on Russia are kind of quite ineffective because it's only really diminishing Putin's reserves rather than stopping his income, and he said that we're giving him about $1 billion a day for his oil. And so, it made me think, like, how has not having a green energy strategy not been at the top of the agenda of most countries, given that the benefits are way more than the power of lobbying companies, in terms of not being held hostage geopolitically, being cheaper for the people, not having like negative externalities like pollution and healthcare costs. So yeah, how has it not been the first thing countries want to do?
Well, thank you, Teja. To begin with, I am in complete agreement that, look, the sanctions are as harsh as they could be, but they're not working. They are working in the sense of creating a lot of hardship for the average rational person, but no hardship for Putin whatsoever. The numbers, I've been looking at the numbers myself. I'm doing some digging of my own. Let me share the results of that. In 2021, Russia had a current account surplus of 95 billion. Okay, that's last year. $95 billion surplus. This year, if we continue along the lines of the present month, and I'm talking about the month of May, it is heading for a stupendous current account surplus of 250 billion, from 95 to 250 billion, right? That's why the ruble has been going up. I mean, only yesterday, the Central Bank of Russia reduced interest rates in order to prevent the Russian ruble from being so high. That's how much the sanctions are not working. And yes, I mean, what the West did was the West confiscated the stored wealth of the Russian state by effectively taking away the reserves of the Russian central bank. But the income, as you put it quite correctly, has been flowing in. And, it's not a great wonder, is it? The sanctions stopped Russians from importing stuff, some of which is hurting the Russian economy very much. Like, not being able to buy spare parts for important machinery, for planes that are flying, commercial planes and so on. This is going to seriously affect the airline industry, various industries and so on. So they've reduced their imports by 45%. Their exports have gone up because even though they are selling less oil and gas, the price of oil and gas has gone through the roof. So the revenues from oil and gas are going up. So, any country experiencing a dramatic fall in imports and a small increase in exports, surplus. So yes, on this. Regarding the second part, look, this is the tragedy of the commons in a way. Redone, a new version of it. You ask the question if I'm correct, if I remember correctly, if I caught it correctly. we have as a species, as humans, as inhabitants of this planet, we have a duty to ourselves and to the next generation to invest in the green transition. We are like, stupid astronauts in a spaceship poisoning the air that we rely upon to breathe. So clearly we need to invest in the green transition, and we're not doing it. Why are we not doing it? It is a clear case of a failure to convert a common interest into a common decision. We should never assume that people, communities, societies, our species is going to do what is in its interest. I mean, individually, sometimes we fail to do what is in our interest. As an agglomeration, as a society, it's very easy to fall into the trap of each one of us doing things that collectively are catastrophic. Adam Smith hoped that competition in the marketplace would bring into alignment our individual greed with our public interest. You mentioned one word which explains why that doesn't happen: externalities. Externalities. If you look at carbon, okay, fossil fuels, while it is absolutely true that humanity as a whole would be far better off, infinitely better off, if we gave up on fossil fuels today and invested in renewables, we'd all be better off, happier. We would have more air to breathe. The next generation would not have to struggle against rising oceans. We wouldn't have huge volatility in the weather, going from drought to flood and from flood to drought. There's no doubt about that. Nevertheless, the people who are today, as we speak, in Davos, who have the economic might that allows them to make the decisions on behalf of humanity, they will make a lot more money in the next 5-10 years if they keep burning fossil fuels. The cost to them, individually, of burning a resource which is in the ground is zero. Their benefits are gigantic at a private level. They have the power to make this happen. They make it happen. And in the end, we look like a very stupid species.
Great. Thank you for the question, Teja. We have another one which has come in, which is the practice of a two-speed Europe between its core and Eastern members pragmatic, or does it just hinder greater integration?
Whenever I hear the term multi-speed Europe or two-speed Europe, I immediately know that this is a declaration of defeat. It's like, we discovered a soothing term by which to discuss our failure. Because the whole point about a union is that, it should be united. If you start creating a union, whether it's a students' union or a European union or an energy union, and you start making provisions for people to opt out of the union, this just goes to show that you're failing. So let's be clear. The possibility, however, still existed up until 1992 of having, if you want, concentric circles. You have a core, then you have a periphery, and a periphery of the periphery. That was, that would not be illogical to do. But I said up until 1992, because in 1992, in our infinite wisdom, I don't mean that, I mean in our infinite inanity, we decided to create a common currency, the euro, without a common polity, without a common political system, without a political union. And that was the end of any possibility of having a Europe of concentric circles. Because to make a common currency work, you need a common central bank. We do have it. It's the European Central Bank. And then, whether you like it or not, you need to have, in the absence of a federation, of a federal treasury, you need to have an austerity union. The only way of managing a common currency without a common treasury is by imposing harsh austerity on the weaker members of your societies and the weaker states, which is what happened in 2010 to this country here, and what has been happening ever since. Not just to this country, but to the poorer Germans, for instance. The poor Germans are suffering huge austerity. Their living standards are falling, have been falling for 18 years straight, in a country which is swimming in surpluses. So the moment you introduce a common currency without a common political system, right, you fall into this trap. And that, you know what it does? It poisons politics. The reason why we have so much racism coming back, so much intolerance, so many ultra-right-wing parties in France, Le Pen nearly won the presidential election. I mean, we are celebrating the fact that the fascists got 45% in France. 45% the fascists. I mean, this is not something we should be celebrating. We should be, burying our heads in the sand, full of shame. You have, as I said before at the beginning, the political system in Germany effectively fragmenting and withering. In that environment, strongmen like Putin emerge within Europe, either in the form of Giorgia Meloni, the fascist leader in Italy, who may very well be prime minister next year, or Orban in Hungary, or the ultra-conservatives in Poland, right? These are not cultural phenomena. They are the natural repercussion of a union that tried to create a common currency without having a political union, without having a constitution, without having a proper parliament. This is the one thing with which I agreed on with Brexiteers in Britain. I was not a Brexiteer, I was supporting Remain, but Brexiteers had a point that, you are doing away with the sovereignty of the British Parliament, but there is no sovereign parliament in Europe even, to which you can transfer the sovereignty, because the European Parliament is a joke. It's not a sovereign parliament. It cannot legislate. It's a parliament that cannot legislate. You only need to state this to realize the level of the stupidity. Did you know that the European Parliament cannot legislate? I bet you didn't. Go and look it up. It can say yes or no to legislation that comes from unelected people like the European Commission, but cannot legislate. So, I will conclude the way I began. When we talk about multiple speed Europe, we are creating terms by which to massage our egos following the declaration of failure.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time. So sorry to those of you whose questions we didn't get round to. But Yanis, a big thank you for spending your evening with us today. And thank you everyone for joining too, especially if you've got exams going on at the moment. I hope that they're going well. Thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of the week.
Thank you. Good luck to everybody with your exams. Thanks, Tom.